A billionaire storms into the room expecting silence, only to find his autistic son calm for the first time in years, resting quietly in the arms of the black maid he barely noticed before. No therapist, no expert, no amount of money had done what she just did with nothing but presence. In that moment, something in him breaks and something else begins. If this real-life story stirs something in you too, tell us. Where are you watching from, and is it morning, afternoon, or the quiet of night? The silence in the Thorne estate was a heavy thing, almost a living entity that pressed down on Julian Thorne's grand marble corridors. He moved through them, a towering figure of tailored precision, his presence usually enough to command quiet from every shadow. But today, a sound had shattered that carefully constructed stillness, a cry raw and piercing that seemed to claw from the very foundations of the mansion. Elara Vance, new to the estate, froze her microfiber cloth still damp in her hand. She had been assigned to routine cleaning in the West Wing, a mundane task for a woman who felt she carried the weight of the world on her slender shoulders. No one had ever spoken of the 5th floor. In fact, most of the staff avoided it, as though it were cursed. Yet the sound that now rose again, a shrill, cyclical sobbing, was impossible to ignore. It wasn't a cry of hunger or fatigue. It was the sound of sheer panic, the kind that tore at one's insides. "Miss Vance!" The head butler's voice echoed from below, a note of warning in his tone. "Stay clear of the upper wing." Elara didn't answer. Her heart, a drum against her ribs, propelled her up the final steps. At the end of the hallway, a partially open door pulsed with flickering light from a sensory projector. A boy, perhaps 7 years old, sat curled on the carpeted floor, rocking violently, rhythmically hitting his forehead against a bookshelf. There was no supervision, no comfort, just the stark tableau of pain and repetition. She paused at the threshold. Every instinct urged her to retreat, to mind the unspoken rules of this vast formal house. But something deeper, an old buried memory, kept her rooted. Her younger brother Caleb used to do the same thing, the same rocking, the same desperate wordless sounds. She remembered it vividly, hiding under the dinner table, his arms tight across his chest, his face streaked with tears. No one seemed to understand. Softly, Elara stepped into the room. She crouched several feet away, careful not to startle him. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice barely audible over his cries. "I'm not going to touch you, just sitting right here." The boy didn't respond, but his furious movement slowed almost imperceptibly. Elara kept her hands in plain sight, palms up. Then slowly she lifted one hand and traced a simple sign across her chest, safe. It was a motion she hadn't used in years, one her grandmother Nana Rose had taught her to calm Caleb when words failed. The boy glanced at her, a mere flicker of his eyes, before resuming his rocking. A sharp voice cut through the air behind her, a thunderclap in the fragile quiet. "What the hell are you doing?" Elara turned quickly. Julian Thorne stood in the doorway, a formidable figure who exuded tailored precision and barely contained fury. In one hand he clutched his phone, the other gripped the doorknob as though it might shatter under his force. "I'm sorry, sir," Elara said, standing instinctively. "I heard him crying, and who gave you permission to be in this room?" Julian's voice cracked like a whip. "No one. I thought he might be in danger. Step away from my son." Her muscles stiffened, but she obeyed carefully, stepping aside. Julian strode toward the boy, but the moment he attempted to lift him, the child erupted, screaming louder, kicking, clawing his arms, flailing in full panic. Julian struggled to hold him, clearly shocked by the intensity. "What's wrong with him?" he muttered, grappling with his son. "Why does he—" "May I?" Elara said, gently stepping forward again. Julian didn't stop her. She knelt, reached out, and the moment Leo felt her presence, his screaming eased. He twisted toward her, collapsing into her arms, as if he'd been waiting for her all along. His small hands gripped her sleeve, and he buried his face in her shoulder. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. Julian stared stunned. What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, sir," Elara said softly, gently swaying with the boy in her arms. "I just listened, and I signed. You know sign language. A little. My brother, he was non-verbal autistic. This used to help him calm down." Julian's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His expensive suit suddenly seemed too tight for him. His formidable presence from a minute ago was now suspended, as if he no longer knew what to do with himself. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly quiet. Elara Vance. I clean the West Wing." "You're not a therapist?" "No, sir. Just a cleaner." He watched her hold his son as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Can you stay a little longer today?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. Julian turned, walking slowly out of the room. For the first time in many months, the grand house was still. No echoes of pain, no tense footsteps, no slammed doors. Just a boy and a stranger, now not so strange, wrapped in quiet understanding. And though Julian didn't voice it, the look on his face spoke volumes. Something had shifted. Something was beginning. The late afternoon sun had dipped lower by the time Ilara descended the stairs again, her back slightly aching from holding Leo for so long. Leo, whom she had learned Julian called him, had finally drifted to sleep in her arms, his face pressed into the curve of her shoulder as though he belonged there. She had laid him gently on a beanbag in the corner of his nursery, covering him with a weighted blanket she'd found folded in the closet. He hadn't stirred. Now the grand mansion felt heavier than when she first entered it. Each chandelier sparkled yet felt cold. Each marble tile under her feet clicked like a reminder that she didn't belong. She was a cleaner, a temporary employee no less, and she had just broken a major boundary. She turned toward the service hallway, fully expecting to be dismissed, perhaps even terminated on the spot. "Miss Vance!" The voice came from behind her, clipped and clear. She turned to find Julian Thorne standing at the end of the corridor, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He no longer held his phone. Instead, he held a small notepad, a legal pad of the kind that usually came out when something official was about to happen. Ilara straightened instinctively. "In my office, please." Her heart sank a little. She nodded and followed him down the long hallway, through a set of double doors into an office she had only ever dusted from the outside. It was immaculate, modern, and sparsely decorated. Dark wood shelves held books with uncreased spines. A wall of windows looked out over the private garden. On the far end sat a massive desk of polished oak. He gestured to the chair in front of the desk. "Sit." Ilara obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. Julian sat opposite her and remained silent for several seconds. He tapped a pen against the edge of the notepad. She could hear a grandfather clock ticking somewhere in the distance. It felt like a courtroom, and she didn't know if she was the witness or the accused. "You handled him like someone who'd done it 100 times, he said finally. "I haven't. Not with him. Just with someone like him. Your brother." "Yes, sir. Caleb. He passed away 4 years ago. He was 10. Julian's eyes flicked up, and for a moment something human, something akin to understanding, passed across his face. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." He was silent again. Then he leaned back in his chair. "No therapist, no specialist, no trained professional has been able to calm Leo down like that. Not in 2 years. They all failed. And you just walked in there with a rag in your hand and fixed him." Ilara's throat tightened. "I didn't fix him, sir. I just saw him." That stopped him. The pen he'd been tapping fell still. "You saw him. Children like Leo, they don't need to be fixed." Ilara continued, her voice soft but steady. "They need to be heard. You can't rush their silence. You have to be willing to sit in it with them." Julian blinked slowly. "You sound like someone who should be doing more than mopping floors." "I'm just someone who needed a job, sir. My grandmother's got medical bills, and this pays better than the diner." He looked down at his notes, then closed the notepad altogether. "I want to make you an offer." Ilara blinked. "Sir." "I'll double your pay," he said, not giving her space to finish. "You'll stay in the staff wing. Private room, all expenses handled, weekends off, health insurance if you don't already have any, and you'll never lift a mop again." Ilara felt her heart racing. The numbers danced in her head. That kind of money could mean real treatment for Nana Rose. No more skipped medications, no more stretching food stamps. But she also knew the risk. This wasn't just a job. This was a boy, fragile with even more fragile trust. If she accepted and failed him, it wouldn't be just another caregiver leaving. It would be a betrayal. I don't know if I can." Julian leaned forward, elbows on his desk. "Look, I've had behaviorists with degrees from Harvard, caregivers from elite agencies, even a family counselor who charged $2,000 an hour. None of them lasted more than a week. You walked in, said nothing, and my son laid his head on your shoulder. I don't know what that is, but I know it's rare." Ilara swallowed. "It's not magic, sir. It's just care. That's even rarer." He watched her, his gaze intense. She looked down at her hands, chipped nail polish and all. She thought about Nana Rose, about the quiet way she'd say, "Baby, if God opens a door, don't stand there arguing about the knob." "When would I start?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll have the room prepared tonight." Alara nodded. Okay, I'll try. Julian stood and extended his hand. She shook it small and firm. As she left the office, her mind was racing. She hadn't packed for a live-in job. She hadn't even told her landlord she was leaving. But beneath all that noise was something quieter, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. The next morning, Alara arrived with a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder and a cardboard box tucked under her arm. The housekeeper, Miss Albright, led her to the staff quarters on the east side of the mansion, near the back garden. The room was simple but warm, a twin bed, a reading chair, a desk facing the window. Mr. Thorne had this redone last night, Miss Albright said, handing Alara a key card. Said you were important. I'm just a helper. Maybe, but he don't give spare rooms to helpers. Alara smiled politely and unpacked quickly, placing a small framed photo of Nana Rose on the nightstand. By 9:30 a.m., she stood outside Leo's nursery again. This time, when she entered, the boy was already awake. He sat on the rug sorting colored blocks into two piles, red and blue. "Morning, Leo," she said softly. He didn't look up, but he paused just for a beat. She stepped closer, sat cross-legged a few feet away, quiet, non-threatening. After a few minutes, he nudged a red block toward her with his toe. She smiled. "Thanks." She pushed a blue block back. The game had begun. Hours passed like that, no words, just color rhythm, repetition. At one point, she began to hum soft, low, familiar gospel tones. Leo didn't protest. In fact, he leaned in slightly the way someone might toward a warm fire. Julian watched from the doorway in silence. He wasn't ready to say it out loud, but something about the way Alara sat there still and steady, not trying to fix or force, made his chest ache in a way he didn't understand yet. Not grief, not fear, something else. Hope. Alara stood by the window of the nursery as dusk crept in, her arms loosely folded, her gaze fixed on the garden below. The day had passed more quietly than she expected. No screaming, no outbursts, no frantic running. Leo hadn't spoken, of course. He still moved in silence, mostly engaged with the wooden puzzles and color-sorting games she had laid out. But he had let her sit closer this time. He hadn't flinched when she sang a soft tune under her breath. He had even touched her sleeve once briefly when she reached across him for a blue triangle piece. That one small touch had lit something in her, a cautious, almost sacred kind of hope. Behind her, she heard soft footsteps. She turned just as Julian Thorne entered the nursery. He wasn't in his usual suit, just a white shirt with the cuffs rolled and gray slacks. His face looked less carved than usual, a little softer around the eyes. "How was he today?" He asked, his voice quieter than the sharp bark she remembered from their first meeting. "Peaceful," she said, a faint smile lifting the corner of her lips. "No meltdowns, no biting or hitting. He was steady." Julian stepped farther into the room, his eyes on his son, who was now lying on his stomach, carefully pushing a toy train along the track. "I don't know what you're doing," he muttered, "but it's working." "It's not a trick, Mr. Thorne," she replied gently. "It's time. It's presence, and letting him lead." He nodded slowly, as if trying to understand a language he had never learned to read. "He used to love trains," he said suddenly. "Sophia, my wife, used to take him to the Railroad Museum every other Saturday." Ilara's gaze turned toward Julian. His face had turned toward the window, now eyes distant. "He hasn't asked to go since she passed." He continued, his voice low and even. "Not once. She didn't say anything, didn't push. Just let the silence speak its part." "I thought we were doing okay," he went on after the funeral. "I hired the best therapist money could find, enrolled him in every specialized program that accepted him. I spared nothing. But it only got worse. The tantrums, the fear of strangers, the screaming." He turned back to Alara. "And now here you are, and he's calmer than I've seen in over a year." Alara shifted slightly. "Grief isn't something you treat like a flu, Mr. Thorne. It's not linear. Not for you, not for him." Julian didn't answer right away. Then he asked, "Do you think he remembers her?" "I think he feels her absence," she said after a pause, "even if he doesn't know how to say it." He sat in the armchair by the bookshelf, elbows on his knees, looking at his son with something between guilt and awe. "I was married for 10 years, he said suddenly. "We met in college. I was rigid. She was jazz. She laughed too loud, danced barefoot on our balcony in the rain-made breakfast at midnight." Alara smiled. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," he said, and something in his voice cracked just slightly. Leo looked up for a moment and locked eyes with his father. Julian stood and approached his son slowly. "Hey, bud," he said softly, crouching beside him. "How's the train coming?" Leo didn't speak, didn't react, but he didn't recoil either. Julian looked up at Ilara. "You think he'll ever talk again?" "I think he already is," she replied, her eyes warm. "You just have to learn to listen to the version of language he trusts." He held his son's gaze a moment longer, then nodded and rose. Later that evening, Ilara returned to her room in the staff wing. It was modest but comfortable. She had unpacked what little she had: 3 changes of clothes, 2 books, a battered journal, and a framed photo of Nana Rose holding a young Caleb. She picked it up now and ran her thumb across the glass. "You'd like him," she whispered. "He's a mess, but he's trying." There was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Miss Albright holding a tray with a covered plate and a folded napkin. "Mister, Thorne says you haven't eaten since lunch." The older woman said, a curious note in her voice. "He insisted you get a proper dinner." Ilara blinked. I didn't realize. I lost track of time." Apparently so did the boy. He didn't scream at all today. Miracle of miracles. Ilara accepted the tray with a grateful smile. "Thank you." Before she turned to go, Miss Albright lingered. "Don't get too comfortable," she warned, but her voice held no malice. "Mr. Thorne changes moods like the wind." Ilara nodded once. "I don't expect anything." She closed the door and sat down at her desk, lifting the lid on the plate: grilled salmon, roasted sweet potatoes, and green beans. Her stomach rumbled in response. As she ate, her mind kept replaying the image of Julian on the floor beside his son. It had been brief, but genuine vulnerable, and she couldn't help but wonder, what kind of man tries to control the world but forgets how to hold his child? The next morning, Ilara entered the nursery at 8:30 sharp. Leo was already awake, sitting by the window, tracing shapes on the glass with his finger. The sunlight cut a warm line across the carpet. "Morning, Leo," she said softly, approaching slowly. He didn't turn, but he didn't stiffen either. She sat beside him, not too close. After a few quiet minutes, she took out a small whiteboard and a dry erase marker. "I thought we could try something," she said gently. She drew a sun, then a cloud, then handed the marker to him. He stared at it for a long moment, then took it slowly and drew a crooked heart. Ilara smiled, even as tears stung behind her eyes. From the hallway, Julian had stopped outside the door. He watched the moment through the crack in the frame, his hand hovering near the handle, but not opening it. Something inside him was shifting slowly, painfully, like an old hinge learning to swing again. He turned away before they noticed, but his thoughts stayed in the room. That night, Julian sat alone in his study with a glass of scotch he didn't drink. On the desk lay a file: Ilara Vance employee application, her background check, and a handwritten reference letter from her former manager at a diner in Queens. He read the note twice. "She's not fancy, but she shows up early, works late, and never complains. She's kind, and she knows how to listen, even when people don't know how to talk." Julian folded the paper and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the wind stirred the trees along the stone fence. Inside, for the first time in months, the silence felt like comfort, not a void. In a house built by money, guarded by rules, and haunted by loss, someone had finally arrived who didn't try to fix the cracks. She simply sat beside them. And for Leo, and maybe for Julian too, that was enough to begin again. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Ilara Vance had taken the job that wasn't hers to begin with, caring for the boy no one could reach. And by now, her presence in the Thorne mansion had gone from anomaly to necessity. Each morning she entered Leo's nursery with the same quiet ritual: no sudden movements, no grand gestures, just the steady rhythm of showing up. And in return, Leo began to offer more. He hadn't spoken not once, but his eyes began to seek her out. He followed her with silent trust. He handed her objects, little things: a block, a button, a puzzle piece, as if they were messages he didn't yet know how to write. That morning, Ilara laid a new routine before him. She brought in a soft mat, some scented clay, and a series of cards with emotions drawn in bold, cartoonish expressions. "This one's happy," she said, showing the first card. "Happy like when the music plays." Leo took the card, touched it once, then looked up at her face. Slowly, he pressed the card to his own chest. "Yeah," she whispered. "That's right." When Julian came home that evening, the house felt different again. Not silent the way it had been for a year. Not empty, but humming faintly, with signs of life. In the kitchen, Miss Albright had soft jazz playing from the tablet. The windows were cracked open. Somewhere upstairs, a child laughed, not loud, not boisterous, but a quick, pure giggle that stopped him in his tracks. He dropped his keys onto the hallway console and followed the sound. Alara was kneeling on the living room carpet, a toy giraffe in one hand, a sock puppet on the other. Leo sat across from her cross-legged, watching intently as the giraffe and the sock puppet mimed a silly fight over a cup of pretend tea. When the sock puppet fell over with a squeaky oof, Leo's mouth stretched into a full smile. No sound came, but his whole face lit up. Julian couldn't remember the last time he'd seen it. Alara noticed him in the doorway. She straightened quickly, brushing lint from her slacks. "Mr. Thorne, I didn't hear you come in." He walked in slowly, still looking at Leo. "Was that him laughing?" She nodded. "Sort of. No sound, but he's getting close." Julian crouched beside his son. "Hey, buddy," he said. Leo didn't retreat. He didn't flinch. He reached out and touched his father's shirt briefly before turning back to the toys. Julian felt his throat tighten. "He's trusting you more," Alara said softly. Julian nodded but didn't look away from his son. He used to play with Sophia like that. She had this sock puppet voice. It was ridiculous, but he loved it. He stood up and looked down at Alara. "Thank you." She gave a faint smile, eyes warm. "I'm not doing anything you couldn't do." "That's the part I find hardest to believe," he said, half joking, half defeated. Later that night, Alara made her way to the small garden behind the staff wing. It was late spring, and the camellias had just started to bloom. She carried a mug of tea, Nana Rose's blend cinnamon and dried hibiscus. She sat on the wooden bench under the magnolia tree and breathed. She'd been afraid at first that her time here would be temporary, that one wrong word, one wrong moment would send her back to mopping floors. But Julian hadn't just tolerated her. He'd started seeking her out. At first, only about Leo, then about meals, then books, and lately just conversation. She didn't fool herself into thinking she belonged in his world. He was white, wealthy, powerful, and guarded. She was none of those things. But when they talked, truly talked, there was something level in it human. The garden gate creaked behind her. She turned. Julian stood in the moonlight holding 2 mugs. "I thought you might like chamomile," he said. She blinked, surprised. "That's very thoughtful." I figured it's either that or more bourbon, and you don't strike me as a bourbon before bed person." She chuckled. "No, that would put me straight on my back." He sat beside her, not too close. "You come out here every night, when I can't sleep." "Same." They sipped in silence for a moment. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, his voice quieter now, more careful. "Your brother. What happened?" She exhaled slowly. "He had a seizure, complications from an infection. He passed in the hospital while I was filling out paperwork for insurance." Julian looked at her. "I'm sorry." "Thank you. He was the only person in the world who saw me without expecting anything back." He was quiet, then said, "That sounds like Leo." "Yeah," she said softly. "It does." Another pause. Julian ran a hand through his hair. "You make this look easy, but I know it's not. I know I'm difficult, that this house can be cold, that Leo's challenges can be overwhelming." She turned to him. "You're not difficult, Mr. Thorne. You're just grieving in the only way you know how." His eyes met hers. "Call me Julian, please." She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, Julian." A gust of wind rustled the branches. The lights from the second floor glowed softly through the windows. Somewhere above them, Leo stirred in his bed. "I want to learn," Julian said suddenly. "I want to know what you know. About him. About how to reach him." Ilara's heart beat faster. "You're already halfway there. I watch you with him the way you read his cues, the way you understand what he needs before he asks. I don't have that instinct." "You don't need instinct," she said. "You need willingness. And he'll teach you if you're patient enough to listen." He looked at her, and for a moment, something shifted in the air between them. "I want to try," he said, and for the first time Ilara saw not the CEO, not the man with perfect posture and calculated words, but a father uncertain, flawed, and finally ready. The next day, everything changed. Ilara led a small lesson in the living room, simple sign language. More, stop, help, love. Julian joined them, clumsy but earnest. Leo watched, then copied. At one point, Julian signed more, and Leo responded with a half-formed version of the same gesture. Julian's eyes filled, but he didn't say a word, just nodded, smiled, and reached for his son's hand. Later that evening, Ilara wrote in her journal by the window, recounting the moment. He's coming back to his son, she wrote. Not as a savior, not as a fixer, but as a father learning a new language, one built on silence, trust, and steady hands. She looked up as a knock came at her door. Julian stood outside holding a book. I found this in Sophia's things, he said. It's about parenting children with sensory disorders. I thought you might want to read it together. She took it gently. I'd like that. And then he added before walking away, thank you for staying. That night, Ilara sat on her bed, the book in her lap, and the memory of Caleb warm in her chest. She wasn't just staying. She was building something slowly, quietly, like Leo's laughter, like trust blooming between unlikely hands. The early summer light streamed through the nursery windows, casting golden beams onto the wooden floor. Ilara sat cross-legged across from Leo, gently encouraging him to press different animal shapes into a soft patch of kinetic sand. It was part of their morning routine, now sensory time before breakfast, a calm, consistent way to ease him into the day. Leo didn't speak, but he responded more and more with eye contact, small gestures, even tentative smiles. When Ilara sang softly, he swayed. When she laughed, he tilted his head to watch her longer. And once, when she reached for the sand mold, he touched her wrist and pushed it gently toward her. Thank you, she whispered. He didn't respond, but his fingers brushed her palm in reply. Julian had begun joining these sessions 3 times a week. He no longer hovered in the background, arms folded and unreadable. Now he knelt beside his son, mimicking Ilara's gestures, learning the signs slowly but with deep concentration. Cow, Ilara signed that morning, forming the horns with her fingers. Leo didn't copy, but he stared, then pointed to the small cow figure on the mat and pressed it into the sand with surprising care. Julian laughed quietly, but genuinely. He's getting it, he said. Ilara smiled, then turned toward him. So are you. That afternoon, Julian invited her to walk the garden with him after lunch. Leo had fallen asleep in the sunroom, a blanket loosely wrapped around him and a stuffed bear held tight in one hand. Ilara hesitated for a moment, unsure if this was still professional, but then followed him out past the manicured hedges down toward the old gazebo. They walked slowly side by side. Julian had removed his jacket and loosened his collar. It was the first time she'd seen him without that ever-present armor. Leo's therapist called this morning, he said. I didn't mention it earlier because I wanted to see how today went. Ilara looked up. Is everything all right? His developmental milestones are still delayed, but she noted significant behavioral improvements. He's beginning to trust again. That takes more than therapy, Julian, Ilara said softly. That takes safety. Julian nodded, hands in his pockets. She also said, well, Ilara prompted, what changed in the home environment? I told her it was you. Ilara chuckled, brushing a braid back behind her ear. I'm just one part of it. He stopped walking and turned toward her. You're the part that matters. She met his eyes, and for a brief second the world narrowed. The breeze slowed, the sound of birds faded. Julian's expression was different now, not the guarded, clipped detachment she'd come to expect, but something quieter, raw. Before Sophia died, he began, his voice more gravel than usual. She said I was always 2 steps behind, that I never saw what was in front of me until it was too late. Ilara said nothing, only listened. She handled everything. The school forms, the therapy sessions, the tantrums. I just wrote the checks. He swallowed hard. And when she got sick, I panicked. I started controlling everything, as if order could save her, as if structure could replace her presence. Grief makes us grasp for anything that doesn't move, Ilara said gently, because what moves might disappear. He looked at her sharply, surprised, then slowly nodded. You speak like someone who's lost something. Someone who's lost someone, she corrected, her voice barely above a whisper. We all carry echoes. They continued walking in silence. The shadows stretched across the garden. Ilara reached out and touched a blooming camellia. These used to grow outside Nana Rose's porch, she murmured. She used to say they were stubborn flowers, that they bloomed when they felt like it, not when others expected them to. Sounds familiar, Julian said. She smiled. I suppose it does. That evening, as the sun dipped low and Leo napped on the couch, Ilara found herself in the study. Julian had invited her to review an old therapy binder he'd found in the closet, notes and videos from Leo's earliest sessions. Sophia filmed everything, he said, handing her a USB drive. She always said, one day we'll forget the hard parts and miss the details. Let's save the details. Ilara sat at the desk and opened the folder. On the screen, the first video began to play. A much younger Leo, maybe 4 years old, sat at a low table with a therapist. Sophia's voice narrated gently from behind the camera, coaching Julian on how to use signs for eat, sleep, and mom. Ilara watched in stillness as the video continued. In one clip, Leo reached toward Julian and signed love clumsily. Sophia's laughter followed. "That's your daddy, baby, good job." Ilara turned slightly in her chair to see Julian standing in the doorway. He didn't enter, just watched his face pale. "I forgot about that video," he said. "I haven't watched these since before the funeral." "She was good with him," Ilara said. "She was everything," he replied, his voice cracked just a little, "and I erased her." Ilara stood and walked slowly to where he was. "No, you didn't. You were surviving. You were breaking open in silence." Julian looked down at her. "Is that what I was doing?" "Yes, but now you're healing." He stared at her, unreadable. "And are you healing too?" She paused. "I think so. Some days more than others." For a long moment they stood there, nothing but the soft hum of the computer and the ghost of Sophia's laughter playing faintly in the background. Then gently, Julian reached out and touched Ilara's hand. She didn't pull away. That night, something changed. Not in words, not in declarations, but in presence. Ilara lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her heart beat fast, not from fear, but from awareness. Something was forming between them, something unspoken, but undeniable. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a visitor in someone else's story. She felt like she might belong to it. Upstairs, Leo stirred in his sleep and mumbled a sound, soft, high-pitched, almost a word. Ilara didn't hear it, but the house did. It was listening now. And so was she. The next morning began with the smell of cinnamon drifting through the kitchen. Ilara stood barefoot on the tile floor, gently flipping slices of French toast on the skillet. Her apron was dusted with flour, and a faint smile played on her lips as she hummed an old folk tune under her breath. It was a quiet joy, simple-rooted something she hadn't felt in years. Julian entered the room quietly, freshly showered, and dressed in a white button-down and gray slacks, but without a tie for once. He paused at the doorway, watching her work. "Didn't know breakfast could sound so good," he said softly. Ilara glanced over her shoulder. "You mean smell." He leaned against the doorframe. "No, I meant what I said." There was a pause, light but meaningful. She slid 2 golden slices onto a plate and turned off the stove. "Leo's still asleep," she said. "Thought I'd surprise him. He likes the edges a little crispy." Julian stepped into the kitchen and began setting out forks and napkins. "You always remember the details." Ilara looked down, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "The details are where the heart lives." He stopped for a moment, considering her words, then resumed setting the table. "I never noticed how empty this place felt until you started filling it." Before Ilara could respond, the baby monitor on the counter crackled softly. Leo's sleepy whimper, then the gentle thump of his feet hitting the carpet. Ilara moved instinctively, removing her apron. "I'll go." Julian touched her wrist. "Let me." It was a subtle shift, but she understood. This was his moment now. She watched as he walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs, a man who used to keep one hand on the world and one foot out the door, now fully present. When he returned with Leo in his arms, the boy was clutching a small plush bear and blinking against the morning light. Julian set him gently in his booster chair and sat next to him. "Good morning, buddy," Ilara said, placing the plate in front of him. "Your favorite." Leo didn't answer, but he picked up a piece of toast with his fingers and began chewing slowly. Ilara watched the way Julian helped him dab syrup on it, his movements careful, patient. There was no rush in the room. No pressure. Just connection. Later that day, the house welcomed a guest doctor, Evelyn Reed, Leo's longtime developmental psychologist, a petite woman with sharp eyes behind silver-framed glasses. She had known Leo since he was 2. She stepped into the foyer with a calm smile. "Still smells like expensive silence in here," she said, half teasing. Julian chuckled. "That's changing." Ilara offered her a glass of water and escorted her to the sunroom, where Leo was stacking wooden blocks by the window. Julian watched from the doorway, his hands clenched just a bit. Dr. Reed observed the boy quietly, then leaned toward Ilara. "He's focused," she whispered, "and peaceful." Julian stepped in. "Do you see progress?" Dr. Reed nodded slowly. "Not just in behavior, in attachment. He's bonding." Julian looked at Ilara. Dr. Reed followed his gaze. Tell me, Miss Vance, what are you doing differently? Elara hesitated. I treat him like he's already whole, not broken. Dr. Reed studied her. That's rare. It shouldn't be. Elara replied softly. After the session, Dr. Reed pulled Julian aside. You've done more than hire help, she said. You've invited something sacred into this house. Don't forget that. Julian didn't respond right away. He watched Elara in the distance, kneeling beside Leo, showing him how to sign happy with her hands. His son mimicked her perfectly shyly, but it was there. That afternoon, Elara wandered out to the garden alone, needing space to think. The camellias were blooming, fuller, now thick with pink and white petals. She sat on the stone bench and exhaled slowly. She was growing attached, dangerously so. This was meant to be temporary, a job, a brief chapter between responsibilities. But somewhere in the quiet moments in Leo's touch and Julian's changing eyes, it had begun to feel like more. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old photo, her mother and younger sister on a porch swing, her mother laughing, head tilted back, her sister's hands caught mid-sign. Elara traced their faces with a thumb. I still carry you, she whispered. Behind her, footsteps approached. I hope I'm not interrupting. Julian's voice gentle now. Elara quickly tucked the photo away. Just thinking. He sat beside her, not too close. I've been meaning to ask. He began, then paused. Why did you take this job? She turned to him, eyes calm. Because I needed to remember who I was, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I could help someone do the same. Julian nodded. You've helped more than you know. A beat. Then Elara said, and you, why did you really hire me? He hesitated. At first, desperation. I was exhausted, out of ideas. But then I saw how Leo looked at you. Not afraid, not shrinking. Just still. They were quiet for a moment. I owe you an apology, Julian added. When you first arrived, I dismissed you. I made assumptions. You thought that I was just a maid, she said without malice. He looked ashamed. Yes. Elara met his eyes. People do all the time. But you're not, he said. No, she whispered. I'm someone who sees people others overlook. He nodded slowly. You saw him. And now I see you. Something shifted in the air between them, delicate and dangerous. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows painted the hallways, Elara passed by the open study door. Inside, Julian sat at the piano, an old upright piece Elara had dusted off weeks earlier. He struck a few tentative chords, then began to play a melody, halting, unsure but lovely. She stood quietly listening. When he finished, she stepped inside. I didn't know you played. I used to, he said. Sophia made me promise I'd teach Leo one day. Keep that promise, Elara said. Music speaks even when we don't. He looked up. Would you sit with me? She did. He began again, slower this time. Elara hummed along, then, without thinking, began to sign the lyrics to an old lullaby, Leo's lullaby. Her hands moved with grace, her face lit with tenderness. Julian stopped playing and just watched. You're extraordinary, he said quietly. Elara looked at him, her hand still mid-motion. I'm just present, she replied. Most people aren't. Julian reached out, brushing a fingertip against her wrist. It was a question. She didn't pull away. It was an answer. Upstairs, Leo stirred in his bed and for the first time called out not with a cry, but a word. Dada! It echoed down the staircase like a bell. Julian froze. Elara gasped, and the house, so long cloaked in silence and grief, suddenly felt alive again. The word hung in the air like a fragile miracle. Dada. It wasn't loud, it wasn't perfectly clear, but it was there, real, alive. Julian shot to his feet, nearly knocking the piano bench over. Elara was already moving her instincts sharper than her thoughts, and together they raced up the stairs. The world suddenly sharpened into focus by that single word. Leo sat upright in bed, his small hands gripping the edge of the blanket. His eyes were wide, not frightened, just uncertain, as if he himself was unsure what had come out of his mouth. But when he saw Julian at the door, something flickered across his face, recognition, a kind of vulnerable hope. Julian dropped to his knees beside the bed. Say it again, he whispered, his voice trembling. Please, just one more time. Leo blinked, lips parting. He looked at Elara, standing just behind, then back at his father. No words came, just a tiny hand reaching forward, resting against Julian's chest. It was enough. Julian wrapped his arms around his son, holding him as though he'd fall apart if he didn't. You did it, he murmured over and over, forehead pressed gently to Leo's hair. You did it, buddy. Alara stood quietly in the doorway, hands clasped to her chest. She didn't intrude, didn't speak. This moment belonged to them. But her eyes, wet, soft, glowing, held the quiet satisfaction of someone who had given a piece of herself and was now watching something sacred bloom. The next morning, the house felt transformed. There was light in the windows that hadn't been noticed before, warmth in the silence that used to echo hollowly. Even the staff moved differently, slower, quieter, reverent, as if they sensed a shift none of them could explain. Julian canceled all his meetings for the day. His assistant didn't question it. Family day, he said, non-negotiable. He spent the morning with Leo reading picture books in the sunroom, building towers out of plastic bricks, and most remarkably getting a giggle when he made a silly face. It wasn't much, but it was a sound Julian had waited years to hear, a sound that brought him to the edge of tears more than once. Alara stayed near, not hovering, just present. She brought snacks, wiped sticky fingers, offered soft encouragements. And whenever Leo looked her way, he smiled small, fleeting smiles, but smiles nonetheless. Around noon, Dr. Evelyn Reed returned unannounced, but not unwelcome. Julian had texted her the night before, 3 words, all caps. He said, "Dada." She stepped into the foyer like a detective entering a scene of quiet joy. "You weren't kidding," she said after watching Leo play for 5 minutes. "His eyes are clearer. He's grounding." Julian nodded. Alara was there when it happened. Dr. Reed turned. "That doesn't surprise me." They stepped aside into the dining room, letting Leo and Alara play uninterrupted. "You know this changes everything," Dr. Reed said. "I know you'll need to consider long-term care, adjust your routines, possibly reintroduce therapies. His progress may accelerate now." "I want you to lead it," Julian said. "But only if Alara stays involved." Dr. Reed raised a brow. "She's not a therapist, Julian." "She's something better," he replied. "She's someone he trusts." Dr. Reed considered this, then nodded slowly. "Fair point." After lunch, Alara excused herself to take a short break. She walked to the garden again, her place of reflection, and sat by the camellias. The spring breeze teased her braids, and she tilted her face toward the sun, letting it warm her skin. She should be happy. Leo had spoken. Julian was changing, but there was a tremor in her chest she couldn't quite name. She was growing roots where she'd promised herself she wouldn't. "Alara," she turned. Julian stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, a hesitant smile on his lips. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't." He sat beside her on the bench, not too close. "I was thinking we should celebrate. Just something small. A dinner tonight. Just us and Leo." Alara's eyes softened. "That sounds lovely." He nodded. "And tomorrow I want to show you something. Something personal." She tilted her head. "It's not far. Just something I haven't shared in a long time. About Sophia." The mention of his late wife made the air still. Alara placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You don't have to. I want to," he said. "You've given so much to our home. I want you to know where this all began." That evening dinner was simple but meaningful. Grilled salmon, asparagus, mashed sweet potatoes. Alara cooked Julian, set the table, and Leo picked out a napkin for everyone. He handed Alara a blue one himself, a red, and his father a yellow. It was the first time Alara had seen him make a deliberate choice that included her. After dinner, they sat by the fireplace. Julian poured them each a glass of wine. Alara's just half as she preferred. "I used to sit right here with Sophia," he said, his voice low. "This exact spot. When we first bought the house, we couldn't afford to furnish most of it, but we had this fireplace and a second-hand record player." He smiled, eyes distant. She used to sing to Leo every night, even when he wouldn't respond, even when the silence felt endless. She never gave up on him. Alara's throat tightened. "You remind me of her," he said suddenly. "Not because you're similar, but because you love with the same stubborn depth." She looked at him surprised. "Julian, I'm not saying that lightly." There was a pause. The fire crackled. "I don't know where this is going," he admitted, "but I know what I feel when you're near, and I know how Leo changes around you." She looked down, heart racing. "Do you feel it too?" he asked. Alara met his gaze. "Yes, but I'm scared. So am I." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Later that night, Alara lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her room was small, modest, tucked at the back of the house, but it was hers for now. A knock came at the door. She rose, heart fluttering, and opened it. It was Julian, not in a suit, not in armor. Just him. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Me neither." He didn't step in, didn't reach for her, just looked at her like she mattered. "I just wanted to say thank you For helping me find him. For helping me find myself." She smiled softly. "Good night, Julian. Good night, Alara." And he walked away. She closed the door, leaned against it, and exhaled long and deep. It wasn't love yet, but it was something real. And that was how everything truly began. The following morning began with an unexpected knock. Not the gentle kind that hinted at domestic routine, but a sharp, echoing rap that stirred both tension and memory. Alara was in the kitchen preparing Leo's favorite oatmeal when she heard it. Julian appeared seconds later, his brow creased even before he reached the door. Standing outside was a man in a tailored gray suit with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He wasn't alone. Two others flanked him, one in business casual, the other in a sharp blazer with an earpiece. The insignia on the clipboard read, "Child Welfare Services." "Mr. Thorne?" the man asked, polite but firm. Julian nodded slowly. "Yes." "What's this about?" "I'm Inspector Thompson. We've received a report of possible neglect concerning your son, Leo Thorne. We're here for an assessment." For a moment, the only sound was the wind through the trees. Alara had stepped into the hallway by then, holding Leo close against her hip. She could feel his little heart pounding through her blouse. Julian stepped outside, pulling the door halfway closed behind him. "This is absurd. Who filed this report?" "I'm afraid we're not permitted to disclose the source during the initial evaluation. May we come in?" "No." Julian said, his voice calm, but Alara recognized the storm behind it. "Not until I speak to my attorney." "You have every right to contact legal counsel," Inspector Thompson replied. "However, if you deny entry during a welfare check, we'll need to escalate. A court order can be requested." Alara stepped forward, still holding Leo, who now clutched her tighter. "He's safe," she said, her voice steady. "I've been with him every day. There's no neglect." Inspector Thompson studied her. "And you are?" "Alara Vance. I've been working here for several months. I'm his full-time caregiver." Another agent jotted something into a notebook. Julian exhaled through his nose. "Give me 5 minutes." He returned inside and made 2 calls, first to his lawyer, Eleanor Vance, then to the head of a private security firm, Chief Maxwell. When he returned, he opened the door fully. "You may enter, but you do so under observation, and nothing is to be touched without consent." They stepped inside, their eyes scanning the foyer like they were entering a crime scene. Alara held Leo protectively, whispering to him in a soft rhythm only he understood. Julian stayed close, his body language sharp, restrained. The agents conducted their assessment with quiet efficiency, checking the pantry, the nursery, the backyard. One agent asked to speak with Leo alone. Alara declined on his behalf. "He doesn't speak with strangers. He has autism. I'm his comfort, his voice. You can ask, and I'll translate in sign if needed." "Noted," Inspector Thompson said, scribbling. They didn't find anything, of course. There was nothing to find. But just before they left, Inspector Thompson turned back. "This visit was protocol, but off the record, Mr. Thorne, it's rare that we see a child this well cared for. Whoever sent the complaint may have had other motivations." Julian closed the door behind them, jaw tight. Alara stood nearby, still holding Leo, who had fallen asleep from the tension. "Someone's trying to get to us," she said softly. Julian nodded. "And I think I know who." He didn't name names. He didn't have to. Later that afternoon, Julian called a meeting in his home office. The guest list was small. Alara, his attorney Eleanor Vance, and Chief Maxwell, a calm, silver-haired man with decades in federal protection services. "This wasn't random," Julian began. "We've been getting resistance on the upcoming tech acquisition. Silent pressure. Now this. I want a full background check on everyone who's had access to my family's internal calendar." Eleanor Vance looked up from her notes. "You think it was an internal leak?" "I think it was personal," Julian said, glancing at Alara. "And targeted." Chief Maxwell tapped the table. "I'll start the sweep. Phones, laptops, digital footprints. If someone tried to weaponize child welfare, we'll find the source." When the meeting ended, Alara lingered behind. Julian looked at her. "You don't have to stay involved in this." "Yes, I do," she said. "This isn't just your fight now. It's Leo's, and I'm not going anywhere." His eyes flickered. "You always speak like someone who's lost something important." Alara exhaled. "I have, but Leo isn't going to be one of those things." He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. That night after dinner, Alara sat on the porch swing with Leo nestled against her. The stars were just starting to show one by one. She watched them light up the sky like old truths finally being revealed. Julian joined her 2 cups of tea in hand. Mind if I sit? She moved over and he took the space beside her, close but not imposing. I used to think silence was a curse, he said. That quiet meant something was broken. But I'm starting to understand there's different kinds of silence. She looked at him. There's the silence of grief, he continued, the silence of shame, and then there's the kind that's safe, like right now. Alara held her tea carefully. Safe silence, that's rare. He nodded, sipping. You've given that to him. To me, too. They sat in that silence for a long while, the night deepening around them. Then Julian asked, have you ever thought about what it would mean if Leo could talk, not just with his hands, with words? Alara looked out into the dark yard. Sometimes, but I think about what he already says in other ways, when he takes my hand, when he leans into me without asking. That's speaking. It's just a different language. Julian's voice was quiet. You're teaching me to listen to that language. And then, like a whisper from the wind, a new voice cut through the quiet, small, hesitant. Mama. Alara froze. Julian looked down. Leo, half asleep, had shifted. His lips had formed the syllable again. Mama. It was no longer imagined, no longer a dream. Julian's eyes widened. Alara's hands trembled. Her breath caught in her chest. Leo. Julian breathed. What did you say? The boy blinked slowly. His eyes fluttered, then closed again. Julian turned to Alara. Did you hear that? I did, she whispered, her voice breaking. I did. It was the first word he'd spoken aloud to her, another testament to the fragile miracle unfolding in their midst. Julian didn't speak for a full minute. Then he reached for her hand. No hesitation, no pretense. We're going to protect him, he said, voice solid now. Whoever came after us, they won't get another chance. Alara nodded, tears finally slipping free. The porch lights flickered gently above them, casting a warm glow on the three of them, seated on that old swing, one step closer to healing, one word closer to a future none of them thought possible. The following morning brought no sense of calm. The house was still, but it carried a tension beneath its quietness, a sense that something unseen had shifted. Julian rose earlier than usual and made his way to the gym, throwing himself into the punching bag with the kind of intensity that didn't come from physical training, but from something deeper, unresolved. Alara woke to the muffled thud of his fists echoing faintly down the hall. She slipped out of bed and checked on Leo first. He was curled up under the quilt, his breathing soft, and even his little arm cradling the stuffed bear she'd mended for him last week. The miracle still echoed in her chest, his voice the word he'd spoken, Mama. It hadn't been loud, but it had been real. Downstairs, Alara brewed coffee, the scent curling through the kitchen like a small gesture of normalcy. By the time Julian returned, sweat-drenched and silent, she handed him a mug without a word. He took it, their fingers brushing. He paused for just a beat too long. Thanks, he said, voice rough. Didn't sleep much. I could tell, Alara replied gently. He stared into his cup, then asked, Has he said anything this morning? She shook her head. But it wasn't a dream. I know what I heard. So do you. I do, he said quietly, then exhaled. But that also means whoever came after us knows how close he's getting, and they might try again. Alara's expression sharpened. Let them try. Julian gave her a look that was half surprised, half grateful. You're braver than most people I know. I'm not brave, she said. I'm protective. That's different. They sat across from each other, a calm before a storm they both sensed was coming. Minutes later, Chief Maxwell arrived, carrying a file under his arm and wearing a look that left no room for pleasantries. I have something, he said as he entered Julian's study. I ran cross-checks on all communications coming out of this property over the past 60 days. There's a match. Someone accessed your schedule through a side channel, an old assistant who still had limited database clearance. Julian frowned. That would be Vivian Shaw. Exactly, Chief Maxwell finished. Terminated 6 months ago, but someone forgot to revoke her cloud-level access. And guess who she's now working for? Alara's jaw clenched. Let me guess. Ether Corp. Chief Maxwell nodded. And not just working. She's engaged to their COO, Victor Moreau. Julian slammed his fist onto the desk. So this wasn't just corporate. It was personal. They knew how to hit where it hurts. Through Leo. Exactly. The welfare report was just the first move, Chief Maxwell added. But there's more. They filed a quiet injunction claiming your acquisition of one of their subsidiaries involved coercion. That's absurd, Julian snapped. They're playing dirty, Alara said, eyes narrowing. And they're using Leo to rattle you. Not just me, Julian replied. Us. Chief Maxwell leaned in. There's one move left, sir. You file a countermotion, bring all of this to light. But it comes with a risk. They'll dig into everything, including Ilara. She looked up. I don't have anything to hide. Julian stood, and even if she did, it wouldn't matter. She's part of this family now. I'm not letting them drag her name through the mud. Ilara's breath caught. He hadn't said those words before, not like that. Her eyes searched his face, trying to find if he meant it or was just trying to protect her legally. But he held her gaze with a quiet certainty. I'm going to make the call, he said. We take them to court, publicly. By late afternoon, news began to trickle out through press channels. Caldwell Dynamics had filed a countersuit against EtherCorp citing defamation, emotional trauma, and abuse of government agencies for personal gain. Ilara watched the news unfold from the guest room, Leo asleep beside her. Her phone buzzed nonstop with messages from friends she hadn't spoken to in years. Some were supportive, some were confused, others were hostile. One message stood out. It was from a private number. I know what you are. He'll find out too. You don't belong there. She stared at it, hands shaking. Julian found her 20 minutes later. Her expression told him everything. He didn't ask. He just took her phone and scrolled. When he saw the message, his jaw tensed. This has to stop, he said. She looked up. They're not going after you. They're going after me, because they can't touch me without touching you first. There was silence between them. Then Julian said, Come with me. He led her down the hall to the family room where a fire had been lit and soft jazz played in the background. Leo stirred on the couch, blinking sleepily. Julian knelt beside him and began signing slowly. Ilara watched, surprised. His signs were clumsy but sincere. Safe. Daddy. Love. Ilara. Leo's face lit up with a small smile. Julian turned to Ilara. I've been learning quietly, because if I'm going to be the father he needs, I can't wait for someone else to teach me. She didn't speak, not at first. Her throat tightened too much. But when she finally found her voice, it was soft. You're already becoming that. That night, Chief Maxwell's team set up a surveillance grid around the estate. Drones, motion sensors, secured perimeter alarms. No one would come near the house unnoticed again. But the storm wasn't just outside. It was in headlines, in whispers, in anonymous comments online. Ilara became a quiet lightning rod praised by some, vilified by others. Rumors swirled that she was a gold digger, that she had seduced Julian for power, that she had manipulated a vulnerable child. Julian tried to shield her. He issued statements, stood by her side at every press conference. But some shadows couldn't be pushed away with statements. One night, after a particularly cruel article called her the maid who would be queen, Ilara sat alone on the back porch wrapped in a blanket. Julian joined her, quietly handing her a cup of tea. I used to think I could fix everything with money, he said. Turns out the things that matter most can't be bought. They have to be fought for. She sipped, eyes red. Do you think it'll ever stop? He looked at her. No, but I think we'll get stronger together. Her voice cracked. Do you ever regret bringing me into all this? He didn't answer with words. He reached over, took her hand, and placed it over his heart. No, he said simply, because you brought me back to mine. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they weren't from hurt. They were from hope. And that night, in the quiet hush of a house on the edge of scandal, the three of them, Julian, Ilara, and Leo, slept under the same roof with something they hadn't shared fully before a sense of family, fragile, earned, but real. The courtroom was colder than expected, a stark contrast to the emotional heat simmering beneath Ilara's skin. She sat quietly beside Julian at the defense table, hands folded tightly in her lap, her breath steady but shallow. Around them, cameras clicked and murmurs stirred as reporters filled every available seat in the gallery. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a spectacle. Judge Eleanor Hayes, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled tightly into a bun, entered and called the session to order her presence, commanding, without being cruel, her gavel echoing through the room with finality. This court will now hear Thorn Dynamics versus EtherCorp, she said, voice unwavering. Ilara's eyes flicked toward the opposing side. Vivian Shaw sat smugly in the front row, her engagement ring catching the light like a trophy. Beside her was Victor Moreau, the COO of EtherCorp, with the coldness of a man who thought everything was a negotiation. They barely spared Ilara a glance, as if her role in the case was ornamental at best. But she wasn't here to be overlooked, not anymore. Julian leaned over and whispered, "They're expecting you to flinch. Don't give them the satisfaction." She gave a tight nod. Her fingers still trembled, but her heart didn't. The first testimonies began. Legal jargon filled the air, each side presenting arguments about data access, unauthorized schedule leaks, and the weaponization of the welfare system. Chief Maxwell took the stand, delivering his findings with clinical precision. He outlined the digital trail, the unrevoked access, and the links between Vivian and EtherCorp. The court listened, but the tension didn't truly rise until Ilara's name was mentioned. And what role did Miss Ilara Vance play in any of these corporate decisions? The opposing attorney asked, voice sharp with condescension. Chief Maxwell answered calmly, "None. She was a house staff member. Her only concern was the safety of the child." "Ah, then why?" the attorney pressed. "Did she continue to involve herself in matters far beyond her professional scope?" Before Chief Maxwell could respond, Judge Hayes raised a hand. "Miss Vance, are you prepared to testify today?" Ilara froze. Julian looked at her. "It's your call." She stood slowly, legs steady despite her heartbeat. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm ready." The courtroom shifted. Every eye turned to her as she approached the stand. Vivian smirked, and Ilara met her gaze without flinching. Under oath, Ilara recounted the events. She spoke of finding Leo, of the silent moments that passed between her and the boy who had not spoken for years. She told them about learning his signs, about the night of the false welfare call, about the terror in Leo's eyes when strangers entered the home. "And did Mr. Thorne instruct you to act beyond your duties?" the EtherCorp attorney asked, leaning forward. "No," Ilara replied, "but I chose to protect that boy. I would do it again." And why would a housekeeper insert herself into such a delicate situation? The implication was clear, the insult hung in the air. Ilara's voice didn't shake. "Because that little boy wasn't just frightened, he was forgotten. And I know what that feels like." The courtroom quieted. Even Vivian's smirk slipped. Ilara continued, "I grew up in a system that never noticed when I went hungry, or when my sister couldn't hear, and no one bothered to learn how to talk to her. I promised myself that if I ever saw that look in another child's eyes, I wouldn't walk away." Judge Hayes regarded her carefully. "Thank you, Miss Vance. You may step down." As Ilara returned to her seat, Julian gave her hand the slightest squeeze beneath the table. "You were remarkable," he whispered. She didn't smile. Not yet. The fight wasn't over. Outside the courthouse steps overflowed with press. Reporters shouted questions about her relationship with Julian, about the rumors of financial motivation, about her background. Ilara kept her chin high, answering none of them. Julian placed a protective hand at her back as they walked toward the car. Inside the vehicle, silence settled again, until Ilara finally asked, "Do you regret putting me on that stand?" He turned to her. "Not even for a second. You were the most truthful person in that courtroom." "But they'll twist it. They always do." "Then let them twist," Julian said. "You don't bend." That evening, back at the estate, Leo sat with Ilara in the sunroom. He was quiet, hands resting on his knees, gaze distant. She signed slowly, "Are you okay?" He hesitated, then signed back. "I heard them say bad things." Ilara knelt beside him. "They don't know you. They don't know us." Leo nodded. Then in halting fingers he added, "You're still here." Her heart broke open a little. "I'll always be here." Across the room, Julian watched the exchange. Later that night, he invited her into his office. There on the desk sat a document, thick, embossed, official-looking. "What is this?" she asked. "My will," he said plainly. "I'm naming you guardian if anything happens to me." "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't talk like that." "I have to," he insisted. "They're not just attacking my business. They're coming after my soul. And my soul lives in that boy." She swallowed hard. "And what if they find something on me? What if they dig too deep? Then let them. Because you've already proven something more powerful than a background check." "What?" "That you love him." There was no romance in his tone, no dramatic flair, just the truth. And sometimes that was the most beautiful thing. Later that week, a ruling came through. The court found insufficient evidence for EtherCorp's allegations and dismissed the case with prejudice. But the judge's final remarks were what silenced the crowd. "I find it deeply disturbing," Judge Hayes said, "that a private corporation would manipulate child welfare systems for corporate gain. Miss Vance's actions reflect the highest moral standard, one we would do well to emulate. This court recognizes her not just as a witness, but as a protector. The room erupted in whispers. Vivian's face blanched. Victor Moreau stood and walked out before the gavel even fell. Outside, the press again swarmed Ilara. This time, the questions were softer, some were even kind. How does it feel to be vindicated? Will you stay with the Thorne family? Julian stepped forward, shielding her, but Ilara didn't retreat. She turned to the camera's eyes steady. I didn't do this to win, she said. I did it because a little boy needed someone who wouldn't leave. That night at home, the quiet was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of something sacred. Leo fell asleep beside her on the couch, his hand curled in hers. Julian stood by the doorway, watching them both with a look that no longer needed explanation. Family wasn't always made by blood. Sometimes it was chosen in the middle of chaos. Sometimes it was proven in a courtroom. And sometimes it was simply a hand held through the storm, refusing to let go. The following morning carried a kind of stillness that felt unfamiliar. Not the quiet of uncertainty, but the calm that follows after a long, punishing storm. Sunlight spilled through the estate's tall windows, warming the marble floors that once felt too cold, too sterile. Now the house seemed alive, not with noise, but with peace. Ilara stood at the kitchen counter making pancakes from scratch. Leo sat on a stool nearby, still in his pajamas, watching her with the soft gaze of a child who finally felt safe. He didn't speak, rarely did, but he signed one word with gentle fingers, happy. Ilara's chest tightened. She turned to him and signed back, me too. Behind them, Julian entered quietly, a cup of coffee in hand, his tie still hanging loosely around his neck. His presence no longer carried the guarded stiffness of a corporate giant. Now there was a softness in his eyes that Ilara hadn't seen when they first met. Smells like you're trying to spoil him, he teased lightly. She gave him a wry smile. If he's going to start his day watching the morning news talk about his dad, he deserves pancakes. Julian side-glanced at the muted television in the corner where a live interview was airing. One of the anchors read headlines off a prompter. Thorne family scandal ends with unexpected hero, the housekeeper who stood against a corporation, the boy who spoke through silence. They're not going to let this go anytime soon, he muttered. I know, Ilara replied, flipping a pancake, but we don't need them to. Leo giggled as the pancake landed perfectly in the pan. It was such a simple sound, so small, but it carried weight. It was joy. And in this house, joy had been rare. Later that day, a letter arrived via private courier. It was hand-delivered and sealed in a cream-colored envelope addressed to Ilara. Her brows furrowed as she opened it carefully. Julian watched her from the library doorway. Something wrong. She unfolded the letter, eyes scanning the handwritten lines, and blinked in disbelief. It's from Judge Hayes, she whispered. She's offering to nominate me for the state's Child Welfare Advisory Board. Julian stepped forward, startled. That's significant. She says she believes my experience, personal and professional, could help shape future policies. Ilara didn't answer immediately. Her fingers tightened around the paper. It's not just about Leo, is it? It's bigger than him. There are more kids like him out there. Julian nodded solemnly. And not enough people willing to fight for them. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Ilara saw something beyond the mansion, beyond even Leo. She saw a path, a purpose, not to escape who she was, but to become more of it. That afternoon, the three of them drove out to a modest community center on the edge of the city. The building was old but clean, its faded blue doors welcoming. Ilara had learned about it through one of the lawyers at the trial, an after-school program for children with disabilities mostly underfunded and understaffed. Inside, children sat in circles, some drawing, others using tablets with assistive communication. One young boy, maybe 7, struggled with his hands trying to form letters in the air. Ilara knelt beside him and gently guided his fingers. Like this, she said, softly signing the word home. He repeated it, his smile stretching wide as he got it right. Julian stood in the doorway, Leo beside him, holding his hand. Neither said a word, but their expressions were identical: awe, admiration, and something tender. When they left, the director of the center followed Ilara out. If you ever wanted to volunteer or teach, our doors are open. She paused, then looked down at Leo, who was now signing to Julian. I think I'd like that. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls in hues of gold, Alara sat alone in the garden. The scent of blooming jasmine drifted through the air, mingling with the distant sound of wind chimes. She held the judge's letter in one hand and her phone in the other. She finally called someone she hadn't spoken to in years, her mother's sister, Aunt Lorraine. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Alara, sweetheart." Her throat tightened. "Hi, I just wanted to hear your voice." "Oh, baby. I saw you on the news. I told your cousins, that girl right there, that's my niece. That's Alara Vance, and she's got more courage in her little finger than most people have in their whole body." Alara blinked away tears. "I didn't think I'd come this far." "Well, you did, and your mama would be proud." They talked for nearly an hour. Laughter returned, pain surfaced, but so did healing. By the time they said goodbye, Alara felt a piece of herself return, one she didn't know she'd lost. Later that night, Alara walked into the nursery. Leo was already tucked into bed, a small nightlight glowing beside him. She leaned down, kissed his forehead, and turned to leave. "Wait," he whispered. She turned, startled. It was the first word he had spoken aloud in months, a clear, intentional sound. He pointed to her and whispered again, "Stay." Alara blinked, swallowed the lump in her throat, and sat beside him. He reached for her hand and closed his eyes. Downstairs, Julian stood at the foot of the staircase, listening. When Alara finally joined him, his eyes searched hers. "You okay?" "I'm more than okay," she said. "I feel whole." Julian hesitated. "There's something I want to ask." She tilted her head. "I know this isn't how things usually go, and I don't want to rush anything, but I'd like you to stay. Not just as staff, as family." Alara's breath caught. "Julian, I'm not asking for answers tonight. I just wanted you to know that no matter what title the world gives you, Maid Witness Advocate, you've already become something far more important to me." She looked away, heart pounding. "This was never about love." "No," he agreed. "It was about truth. But sometimes when the truth is finally safe, love follows." In the following weeks, Alara accepted the judge's nomination. She joined advocacy circles, traveled with Julian and Leo to community meetings, and started designing inclusive curriculum for schools. Her story spread quietly, respectfully, not as a fairy tale, but as a reminder that sometimes it's not the powerful who change the world. It's the ones who dare to care when no one else will. One spring morning, nearly a year later, a framed photo sat on Julian's office desk. It showed Alara and Leo sitting beneath a tree, sunlight filtering through the leaves, both of them laughing with abandon. Above the image in small engraved letters, it read, "Family is the place where the storm breaks." And beneath it, a simple quote from Alara herself, "Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up and staying. Thank you truly for staying with us until the end of this heartwarming story. If you felt something, if this real-life story touched even a quiet part of your heart, know that you're not alone. Somewhere, someone else is watching too, feeling what you're feeling. We don't know where you're watching from, but we'd love to. Let us know in the comments where in the world are you joining us from tonight. And if this story gave you pause, gave you warmth, gave you hope, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and staying with us. Your support means more than you know. It helps this little corner of the internet keep telling stories that matter. Until the next bedtime story, the next moment of quiet connection. Thank you from the heart. We'll see you soon.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.